Jon stood at the edge of the campsite, the cold northern wind clinging to his cloak, biting at his cheeks. He gazed out upon the flickering torches, the hurried silhouettes of men weaving between tents, the warhorses stamping the frozen ground. He was still coming to terms with the letter he had received less than a day ago, a summons carrying the direwolf seal of House Stark. He had read the words penned in Robb's unmistakable hand a dozen times. Despite the late hour and the unrelenting wind that howled along the ramparts of the encampment, sleep would not find Jon Snow. Robb Stark wanted him to come south from the wall to Moat Cailin. There, Robb said he had urgent need of his brother, his true brother. The words were loaded with promise and peril alike. He walked along the perimeter, remembering how he used to watch his stepbrothers train in the courtyard of Winterfell, always relegated to the edges. He had felt the difference between them every time he heard someone call him Snow, but the letter clutched in his gloved hand might change all of that. Jon exhaled sharply, letting the cold gnaw at him for a few moments more before he turned toward the makeshift stable at the edge of the camp. His horse waited, saddled and restless. At dawn, Jon would ride for Moat Cailin. When he arrived, he suspected everything in his life would change. His decision had not been easy. The vows of the Night's Watch still echoed in his mind. But even before the summons came, his life on the wall had become more complicated. He had done what he must to broker a fragile peace with the wildlings, had faced creatures he barely understood in the frozen wilderness, and had lost too many brothers to count. He had found himself increasingly weighed down by a sense of duty that surpassed the Watch. He had always told himself that duty to the realm meant sacrificing personal ambitions, but these were not ordinary times. The war to the south raged on, and perhaps the greatest danger that loomed, the white shadows beyond the wall, could not be met by the Night's Watch alone. He had come to believe it might well require more than black robes and a crumbling wall to stand against the ancient threat stirring in the far north. He had begun to question if loyalty to the Watch meant ignoring a larger calling. Then the letter arrived, and Jon felt the old longing stir in his blood. He had always wanted to be a Stark. He had always wanted that name, that identity, to walk in the steps of Eddard Stark. And now Robb was offering precisely that, but with it came an enormous burden. He mounted his horse at first light, the sun barely a dull glow hidden behind a steel-gray sky. He didn't look back at Castle Black. He didn't know if he would ever return. The path south was lonely. The north was not as sparse of life as the far wilderness, but he rarely met travelers. He took advantage of empty roads to rehearse in his mind what he might say to Robb. The official seal on the summons revealed little more than the words that asked him to come. But he knew. He sensed the magnitude of what was implied. If Robb intended to name him Stark, then it was an act loaded with potential consequences for all the lords and all the other claimants to the Iron Throne. Yet Robb was king in the north, and if he had chosen to legitimize Jon, it meant he saw a way forward that demanded Jon's presence, perhaps not just as a brother, but as an heir, or a co-commander, or some piece on the chessboard of lords and kings. Jon did not yet know how he felt about that. After days of hard riding, the looming towers of Moat Cailin came into view, little more than crumbling ruins that spiked out of the swampy ground. The reek of stagnant water filled the air. A thick mist crawled over the wetlands, and the makeshift encampment around the old fortress bristled with Stark banners. It had been some time since Jon last saw the field in which the great gray dire wolf snapped on a field of white, and seeing those banners made him feel both proud and uncertain. Guards in Stark livery halted him at the perimeter, but one recognized him by his black cloak and let him pass. Word spread quickly, and soon Jon found himself surrounded by curious looks and hushed whispers. He could almost taste their uncertainty. He was a brother of the Night's Watch. Did he not still wear the black cloak, frayed and caked with frost and mud? Yet they addressed him as my lord, not brother. And Jon did not correct them. The men guided him into what remained of Moat Cailin's central tower. It was in better shape than the rest, with fresh timbers shoring up collapsed walls. Robb stood among his northern bannermen, brow furrowed as he examined a map spread across a rough-hewn table. When his eyes lifted and he saw Jon, a grin flickered across his features, brief, weighed down by war, but still a grin. The parted crowd let Jon through. For a moment, the two of them simply stared. Robb, older and heavier with responsibility than Jon remembered, stepped around the table and clasped Jon in a firm embrace. I'm sorry to call you away from your vows, Robb said in a low voice, but I fear we have no choice. The king in the north led Jon away from the onlooking lords and out into a quieter corridor where torchlight flickered against damp stone. Robb dismissed his guards with a curt nod, leaving the two alone. Jon expected a firm speech, a command, or some grand pronouncement. Instead, Robb's face looked as if it carried the weight of a dozen battles. The war goes poorly, he admitted. I have done what I can, but I've lost too many. Too many men. Too many friends. My mistakes, my mother's mistakes, the betrayal of others I trusted. And through it all, I've come to realize what Father must have always known. The North must stand united, or it will fall. Not just to the southern armies, but to what you told me about, what you saw beyond the wall. The others. The dead who walk. The lords here refuse to believe it, but I see it in your eyes. Father once told me you were never one for lies or exaggerations. Jon nodded gravely. The threat is real. We faced whites at the fist of the first men. The wall is strong, but even it can only do so much. If winter is truly here, the dead will come in numbers we cannot imagine. Robb gripped Jon's shoulder. All the more reason we need you, he said. And not just as Jon Snow. I want to name you Jon Stark as my brother by blood and by heart. I have the power as king in the north. I need you at my side to help me unite our people. Without unity, we can't hope to stand against southern armies, let alone an undead horde. Will you accept? Jon felt his chest tighten. He had longed for these words, yet now that they were offered, they carried a weight as icy as the wind. To become Jon Stark was to forsake the Night's Watch, or at least to break from its traditions. It was an honor that made his heart pound, and also a responsibility that made him tremble. Robb, your grace, he began, uncertain of how to address his brother now. But Robb only shook his head. Call me Robb, he said. When we're alone, anyway. Jon took a slow breath. You realize what this means for the Watch? I swore an oath. I know, Robb said. But I also know our father would have said duty sometimes demands we do what is necessary for the realm, even if it means bending old vows. There's a war on all sides. The Night's Watch was meant to protect the realms of men, and I say you're better served in that duty by standing at the head of our armies, forging a union that will guard the north from every threat. Accept my offer, and I will see that no man on the side of the neck calls you Oathbreaker. We have bigger enemies than the honor-bound lines of old men, Jon. We need a shield for the living. There was no mistaking the sincerity in Robb's voice. He had grown into a king, but one who wore his responsibilities like a chain that weighed upon every step. Jon cast his eyes downward. Then I accept, he said, and in that moment he felt something shatter inside him, the old identity of a bastard, of a man bound by a vow he believed unbreakable. And something new took shape in its place. The vow still lived on in him, but changed, directed outward to the men and women he loved, to the realm he knew must survive the coming darkness. Robb grasped his hand. You are my brother in truth, he said quietly. Tomorrow I will call the lords together and name you officially. Then we ride to White Harbor, or perhaps even north if you think it best. We must plan carefully, for Stannis Baratheon has landed in the north. He's taken Deepwood Moat back from the Ironborn, and he claims he's coming to save us from the wildlings and from whatever else lurks beyond the wall. But I don't trust him. He desires our allegiance in return for proclaiming him the true king. Jon's thoughts drifted to Stannis. He had met the man briefly at the wall. Stannis Baratheon was stern, determined, with an iron sense of justice. He meant to claim the Iron Throne by right, but he also seemed more willing than most Southerners to acknowledge the threat beyond the wall. Stannis might be an ally, Jon allowed, though I'd watch him carefully. He's single-minded. And Melisandre, his Red Priestess, she's full of omens and flames. I don't understand half of what she does, but there's a power about her. Robb nodded. That is precisely why I want you there when we negotiate. You've spoken to him. You know him better than I do. If we can unite the North and ally with Stannis, perhaps we can stand against the Lannisters, the Boltons, the Freys, and whatever else the gods decide to throw at us. Jon had never imagined he would play the role of a diplomat, yet the swirl of events allowed no room for hesitation. That night, Jon slept in the old keep at Moat Cailin, but he tossed and turned as if the spirits of the bog kept whispering dire secrets into his ear. He dreamt of the others marching across a field of snow, steel-blue eyes unblinking. He dreamt of a monstrous wave crashing down upon Winterfell. He dreamt of ghostly dire wolves howling at the crumbling battlements of the wall. When he rose at dawn, he felt a subtle dread that he could not shake. Still, the day's ceremony awaited him, and he resolved to meet it without cowardice. Banners fluttered in a cold breeze as the lords gathered in the open yard. Many who had supported Robb from the first days of his rebellion stood now in attendance, curious, cautious, some faintly disapproving. The rumor had flown among the rank and file. Robb meant to name his bastard brother a true-born Stark. Yet the hush that fell over the gathering showed respect, if not for Jon, then certainly for Robb and the memory of Ned Stark, the man who had guided them for so many years. Robb emerged wearing the crown of the king in the north, plain bronze set with iron spikes, simple compared to the ostentatious circlets of southern kings. "My lords," he declared, "I have summoned you here for a matter of grave importance to the future of our kingdom. I call forward Jon Snow, sworn brother of the Night's Watch." Jon stepped forth, ignoring the stone-like gazes of great men who had never thought of him as anything more than a base-born son of Ned Stark. He met Robb's eyes and saw the unwavering resolve in his brother's face. "I name you Jon Stark," Robb said, "son of Eddard Stark of Winterfell, and brother to me in all but name which shall now be bestowed upon you. I proclaim you a true-born Stark with all the rights and responsibilities therein. Do you swear to fight for the North, to defend it against every foe from every quarter?" Jon drew in a breath. "I do," he said. "By the old gods and the new, and by our father's memory." Robb nodded, jaw taut. He placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Then rise as Jon Stark, brother of the king in the north, warden of the north in my stead should fate befall me, and rightful heir to Winterfell after me and mine." Murmurs broke out among the crowd. It was not only an act of legitimization, but nearly an act of naming Jon next in line for the seat of the Starks. Jon could feel the weight of 1,000 stares. A piece of him reeled at the enormity. He remembered the words of the Night's Watch vows, "I shall wear no crowns and win no glory." Now he stood in front of hundreds, if not thousands, receiving something that was a crown of sorts, a portion of glory he had never imagined could be his. Yet he also felt a sense of belonging. He had yearned for this his entire life, in some buried corner of his heart. His father's memory seemed closer, as though Ned Stark were standing behind him, resting a hand on his shoulder, silently telling him that this was the right path for the world as it was now. That evening a quiet feast was held, or as close to a feast as could be managed in the sparse surroundings. The men dined on salted fish and hearty bread, with some watered wine to wash down the cold. Jon sat at Robb's right hand, conscious of every curious glance. He could see the great Jon roaring in laughter nearby, see Lord Bolton's son, Ramsay, lurking at the edges, his eyes narrowed. No, Jon reminded himself, Ramsay was not the rightful Bolton heir. He was merely rumored to be legitimized by Roose Bolton. Jon found himself disliking the man on instinct. Something about him seemed too cunning, too hungry for cruelty. Memories of Theon Greyjoy's betrayal flashed in Jon's mind, and he felt uneasy in the presence of anyone who might harbor illusions of power. Robb tapped his new wine cup gently against Jon's. "I know how strange all of this must feel," Robb said in a low voice. "It still feels strange to me, and I've been wearing this crown for what feels like an age. But I'm glad to have you here, brother. More than I can say." Jon allowed himself a small smile. "I'm with you. Now and always." Their conversation was hushed, but Jon felt the warmth of acceptance. He glanced around. Despite the air of desperation that hung over the camp, the men seemed lifted by the news. A Stark among Starks. Perhaps they saw it as a sign that the lineage of Winterfell was unbroken, that hope still flickered in the face of war and betrayal. That night, Jon found he could sleep more easily, even as the wind moaned and the memory of dead men in the snow still lurked in his dreams. Come morning, Robb and Jon rode side by side, leading the host away from Moat Cailin, heading north to White Harbor. Robb had decided that trying to outmaneuver every trap laid by the Lannisters or the Freys in the south was futile. The strategic choice was to consolidate northern power, and that meant forging alliances with the houses still loyal and preparing for any confrontation with Stannis. Jon rode with Ghost loping beside him, the great white direwolf silent in the morning frost. Ghost's presence was a reminder of the old days at the Wall, and also a comfort. Jon's mind hovered on the question of how to handle Stannis. During the ride, Robb confided, "Lord Wyman Manderly has pledged men, but White Harbor suffered from Ironborn raids. They need reassurance. We cannot protect every shoreline alone. Stannis claims he will drive away the Ironborn for good. Perhaps it's a promise we can hold him to." Jon thought back to his time at the Wall. Stannis had indeed attacked the Ironborn at Deepwood Moat. Word was that he had forced them out, capturing their leaders. "Stannis can be merciless," Jon said. "He burns those he deems traitors. But if he sees advantage in an alliance, he might be open to negotiation." The roads wound through bleak forests and across ice streams. They passed villagers who emerged to watch the king in the north pass by, some with awe, others with fear. War had taken its toll on every corner of the realm. Fields lay scorched, crops had failed. The bitter reality of winter was setting in, and people starved. More than once, Jon slowed in the saddle to gaze upon children with hollow eyes and mothers who stood behind them with lips pressed thin. These were the realities of war, and he now carried a share of the responsibility for seeing them protected and fed. It was a heavy burden, but one he felt deeply, more than ever now that he was Jon Stark. When they finally arrived at White Harbor, they found it bristling with activity. The city was alive with merchants trying to turn a profit from the war, and refugees crowding the streets in search of a morsel of bread. The Manderleys greeted Robb in the echoing hall of their seat, the new castle. Wyman Manderley, heavy of body and grave of demeanor, bowed to Robb. He then fixed his gaze on Jon. A hint of curiosity flickered in his eyes, but he offered a courteous nod. "Your Grace and my Lord Stark," he said, the second title spoken with careful solemnity. "Welcome." Jon nodded in return. He was not used to hearing himself addressed so formally. The entire journey felt like an unending series of jarring moments, each reinforcing his new place in the hierarchy of the North. Wyman led them into a smaller chamber beyond the main hall. Wine and steaming pies lay on a table, but the mood was far from festive. The Manderleys had lost men. Their trade routes were disrupted by the war. They needed certainty if they were to continue supporting Robb's campaign. Robb did not waste time. "We have come to secure White Harbor's pledge and to discuss the Baratheon presence in our lands. Lord Manderley, have you had any word from Stannis?" Wyman steepled his thick fingers over his stomach. "We have, Your Grace. A raven arrived. King Stannis claims he will soon march across the north to gather what allies he can. He expects fealty. He sees himself as the rightful king of Westeros, validated by the laws of succession and by the light of the Lord. He offers pardons to those who kneel and retribution to those who do not." "Then let him come," said Robb, though his tone lacked its usual confidence. He glanced at Jon, then back at Wyman. "We propose a different course. If Stannis can be brought to the table, we might find a more beneficial arrangement than a demand for subjugation. But I want to hear what you think, Lord Manderley." Wyman pursed his lips. "I think this land has seen too much blood. If Stannis can be turned from foe to ally, it would be wise. But I also know the North is proud, and we do not bend easily, not to kings from the south, nor the east, nor anywhere else. If you can arrange a parley, I will attend. I suspect other lords might do the same if called upon by you, Your Grace." Robb nodded, relief edging his features. "Then we must prepare. Let it be known that the king in the north invites Stannis Baratheon to White Harbor to negotiate. If he agrees, we'll speak under the banner of peace. If he refuses, then he has shown his true colors, and we will do what must be done." In truth, the question was whether Stannis would agree to treat with Robb at all. Their claims to kingship stood in conflict. But Stannis had marched to the wall once before in an attempt to gain northern favor. Jon believed the man's sense of duty might outweigh his pride, especially with winter deepening. The watchers on the walls of White Harbor lit beacons that night, a signal to the smaller holds in the region that something was afoot. In the morning, ravens were dispatched to the last known location of Stannis' camp. While they waited for a reply, Robb and Jon took counsel with Lord Manderley, discussing possible strategies if negotiation failed. Their combined forces, battered from the War of the Five Kings, were still formidable in the north, but winter had arrived. Provisions ran thin. The men were weary. The common folk needed respite. A war with Stannis could drain whatever strength remained. Jon found himself pacing the sea walls, Ghost padding silently beside him, scanning the horizon for any sign of a fleet or an army. The windwater spilled into the harbor, its waters dark and choppy. Gulls wheeled overhead, screeching into the cold. In these moments, Jon felt the tug of the wall in his heart, a reminder of the war that truly mattered. He forced himself to focus on the here and now. The North must be made strong, or the realm might not survive at all. Finally, after days of uneasy waiting, a raven arrived bearing the seal of Stannis Baratheon. Jon joined Robb in the main hall as they broke the seal and read the words. Stannis would come to White Harbor under terms of truce to hear what the king in the north had to say. He wrote that he brought men and that Melisandre of Askai would accompany him. No more details. No threats. No overtures. Just a stark declaration that he would come. Robb turned to Jon with a half-smile. You have your wish. Let us hope this parley does not end in blood. Jon nodded, pushing aside the swirl of doubts. We must be ready. They made their preparations. Robb insisted on a smaller guard presence within the main hall to avoid any threat that might spook Stannis or provoke him to aggression. The Manderleys grumbled about letting so few guards in the same hall as a southern king and his entourage, but Robb wanted to show good faith. Jon, for his part, insisted that Ghost be allowed at his side. He trusted the direwolf's instincts more than any guard's spear. The day came gray and cold, with the tide rolling out of the harbor in a slow retreat. Jon and Robb stood on the ramparts to watch as a column of men approached the city. At their head, banners bearing the crowned stag of Baratheon flapped in the biting wind. The men marched with disciplined steps, carrying themselves like soldiers who had seen real war. And at the center, mounted on a tall, black destrier, rode Stannis Baratheon. Even at a distance, Jon recognized the grim line of his mouth and the stiff set of his shoulders. Riding beside him was the woman in red, Melisandre, her hair ablaze of color against the monotony of the northern drab. The gates creaked open, and Robb and Jon descended to greet them in the courtyard. If there was any inclination to bow, neither man displayed it. Robb, crowned in bronze and iron, nodded curtly. Stannis Baratheon, I bid you welcome to White Harbor. Stannis halted his horse, dismounted with brisk efficiency. Robb Stark, he said, his voice rough. King in the North, they call you. A rebellious title, but I will not quibble if we can come to an accord. He paused, looking around with keen blue eyes that missed nothing. He settled his gaze on Jon. Jon Snow, he said, and then corrected himself. Jon Stark, I am told now. Jon inclined his head. Your Grace. A flicker of what might have been acknowledgement passed over Stannis's face. Perhaps he recalled the conversation he once had with Jon at the wall, how he had offered to legitimize him in exchange for loyalty. Now Robb had done it instead. The subtle tension was almost palpable. Melisandre said nothing, but her eyes gleamed as she regarded Jon. She had once told him he had a role to play in the war against the darkness. He had not forgotten, nor had he dismissed her power, though he did not trust it. Robb gestured politely. Shall we speak inside, out of this wind? With minimal fanfare, the two kings and their retinues proceeded into the great hall of the Manderleys. Torches sputtered, struggling against the drafty corridors. At Robb's signal, servants brought heated wine, but neither Stannis nor his red priestess seemed interested. Jon stood at Robb's right hand, bearing the sigil of House Stark on his doublet for the first time. Ghost took a place by his feet, alert and watchful. When at last everyone was settled, Robb on the dais, Stannis on a seat of equal height to signify they treated with each other as kings, there was a moment of silence. Then Stannis leaned forward, expression as taut as a drawn bow. I have come a long way in the name of duty, he said. My rightful throne is kept from me by those who would see this realm cast into chaos. I have faced the false king at King's Landing, and I have faced the threat of wildlings at the Wall. I have fought Ironborn in your lands and liberated Deepwood Moat. All I require now is the fealty of the North. Bend the knee, Robb Stark, and I shall confirm your seat as Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North. I will help you rid your lands of any Ironborn incursion. And together we will turn our forces upon the Lannisters. Robb's face remained impassive, though Jon suspected his brother bristled inwardly at the phrase bend the knee. You have done much for the North, Robb allowed. I do not deny that. But you stand in a city that has named me king. We are an old people, Lord Stannis. Our loyalty is not easily given to Southron kings and certainly not demanded. The North has bled. The men who follow me have sworn an oath and I cannot betray them. The tension in the hall spiked. Stannis's eyes narrowed. Melisandre smiled as if she saw something in the air that amused her. Jon swallowed, stepping forward slightly. Your Grace, he addressed Stannis, the Night's Watch has always known the value of the realm's unity. I have seen you fight at the Wall. I have seen your discipline and your devotion to duty. That is what we need. The war that comes will not stop at the southern borders. The dead walk and the living must stand together. We can do that more easily if the North and House Baratheon stand side by side. He paused, letting the words hang in the cold air. But we will not be commanded and we will not be subjugated. We are open to alliance, not conquest. The North has always been free to choose its own king, and they have chosen my brother. Stannis's jaw twitched. You presume to lecture me, boy? There was more weariness in his tone than anger, though. I have seen that threat, yes. The whites, the others. I know what is at stake. Melisandre spoke then, her voice resonant. The Lord of Light has shown me much in my fires, she said. An ancient darkness rises, one that threatens to swallow the world in an endless night. Only Azor Ahai Reborn can stand against it. The choice is not between small men's crowns. The choice is life or death, fire or ice. Jon felt her red gaze upon him. A chill ran down his spine. The last time she had spoken such words, she had hinted that he, not Stannis, might be the hero of her prophecy. But she had never declared it outright in front of the man she served. Robb cleared his throat, ignoring her ominous tone. You came to the north once before, Stannis, and asked for our support. You found little, as my understanding goes. My father was killed in King's Landing, murdered by the Lannisters. My brother was killed after proclaiming himself king in the north. And now I wear this crown in his stead, not lightly, but because our people demanded it. I suggest we focus on the real war, defeating those who would tear the realm apart and preparing for the threat beyond the wall. In that spirit, I propose a mutual recognition of each other's titles. You as king on the Iron Throne, should you take it, and I as king in the north. We will stand beside you against your enemies, including the Lannisters, so long as you stand beside us in defending our lands from the undead host. The hush that followed was as tense as a drawn sword. Stannis's expression darkened, as though Robb's words were a personal affront. You ask me to condone the fracturing of the Seven Kingdoms. You ask me to give up a great portion of what is rightfully mine. I cannot. My duty is to unite the realm, not splinter it. Robb's voice hardened. Your duty might be easier with allies than with foes. Are you prepared to go to war against the North just to claim a crown over a land that has no desire for southern rule? Jon could see the furious glint in Stannis's eyes. The man's sense of duty was absolute, his claim unwavering. Yet he had come here invited by the very king he might consider a rebel. That alone suggested a sliver of openness. Jon took another step, placing himself subtly between them. Might we consider a different arrangement? He asked, thinking aloud. One that allows the North some autonomy without fully severing ties to the Iron Throne? If the goal is truly the realm's preservation, there must be room for compromise. Stannis swung his gaze to Jon. And if I let the North go, how do I respond to the Iron Islands or Dorne, or any other kingdom that decides it too would be independent? The Seven Kingdoms would shatter into petty fiefdoms. It was a valid point. Jon's mind worked fast. What if the arrangement was that the North remains under Stark rule, but in alliance with the Baratheon crown, with the provision that in times of war we unite as one realm? Autonomy in peace, unity in war. This would be a special accord given the burdens the North has faced, the undead threat, the onslaught from beyond the wall, the savage winter. The Crown Your Crown would gain a powerful ally and the North would gain the freedom it craves. Melisandre's red skirts rustled as she shifted her stance. She studied Jon with an intense curiosity as though she saw the shape of his words dancing in the flames of her mind. Robb's features were guarded, but Jon knew his brother well enough to sense he was intrigued. Stannis, for his part, seemed to weigh the suggestion. He glanced at his advisors, a handful of grim knights standing behind him. They offered no immediate counsel. At last, Stannis spoke. It is a compromise. Not one I would have chosen. But perhaps the realm has changed too much for old boundaries to hold. And winter is here, an especially harsh winter by all accounts. We cannot afford a war in the North that would weaken us both. If the North joins me against the Lannisters and any other threats, I will grant it a degree of autonomy. The details must be ironed out. But I will not call you king. That is too far. Robb stiffened. My men will not abide being named less than free. If you cannot stomach the word king, then call me something else, as long as it is clear that Winterfell rules the North independently of the Iron Throne. We can shape the title in a way that satisfies your claim while honoring the vow I made to my bannermen. You speak in riddles, Stannis said with a faint growl. But perhaps it can be done. Warden of the North once carried such weight, but that was always an appointment from the Iron Throne. Now you claim it by right of blood and war. Humph. I will consider it. He folded his arms, expression as rigid as the stone pillars of the hall. In truth, these matters pale compared to the shadow rising in the north. The Red Woman sees visions of ice and death. I have seen a portion of it myself. If we do not stand together, we shall die alone. All men, all kingdoms. Jon exhaled, feeling a strange sense of relief. Stannis had not stormed out, blood had not been spilled. The negotiations were precarious, but they were on a path, perhaps a tenuous one, that might lead to peace and cooperation. He noticed the flicker of gratitude in Robb's eyes as his brother glanced his way. Then the hush was broken by Lord Wyman Manderley's voice, jovial and grave in equal measure. Well then, he said, shall we dine? Let this alliance or near alliance be discussed over something hot to eat. Surely the cold wind is no place to find agreement. Stannis, for all his sternness, gave a curt nod. I suppose that is wise. I have marched my men through the snow. Food would be welcome. So they broke from the dais to gather at a long oaken table in the hall, the tension still simmering in the air. Robb and Stannis sat at the head, with Jon beside Robb, Melisandre across from him. The other northern lords shuffled in, uncertain how to regard the southern king who refused to call Robb the same. Yet the conversation continued, subdued. They spoke of strategies, of supply lines, of the Ironborn and the Lannisters. They spoke of the Vale, whose boy lord might be persuaded to offer men. They spoke of how best to incorporate the remains of the Night's Watch into the conflict, though Jon made it clear that the Watch was meant to stand apart from southern wars. Still, if the realm was truly threatened, the Watch might not have the luxury of standing aside. Melisandre lingered after the meal, wine in hand, moving closer to Jon and Ghost. The dire wolf bared his teeth slightly at her approach. She regarded Ghost with an almost playful fascination before her red eyes fixed upon Jon's face. You have changed your cloak, she noted in her exotic accent. But perhaps your destiny remains the same. Jon tensed. I never put much faith in destiny, my lady. A slight smile curved her lips. Ah, but destiny does not require your faith. It will find you regardless. Her gaze swept over him, and he almost felt he could sense the heat rolling off her in waves, despite the chill hall. Beware the shadows that come with the night, Jon Stark. The cold is not your only enemy. Some shadows are cast by men, and they too can bring ruin. With that cryptic warning, she slipped away, robes trailing behind her. Jon let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. The hall began to empty, lords and knights dispersing to corners for quieter discussions. Robb stood by the dais in deep conversation with Stannis. It was almost surreal to see them side by side, two kings, each battered by war, each carrying a sense of urgency. Jon made his way closer, wanting to catch the tone of their words. As he drew near, he heard Robb say, Winterfell is our seat, but it's no fortress compared to the wall. If the others truly come, we will need to gather behind stronger defenses. Stannis inclined his head. The wall is the first line. We should commit men there, fortify Eastwatch and Shadow Tower. I had half a mind to do it myself, but my forces are too few, and I cannot hold a siege if the Lannisters choose to strike. That is why I need the north behind me, Stark. It seems we are in agreement on at least that, Robb said, a haunted look in his eyes. Our father always said winter would be our test. May the gods help us pass it. Jon drew in. If I may, he said, the wildlings remain a concern. Not because they're enemies, they've suffered losses in their attempt to flee the others, but because they complicate matters. Most of the Watch sees them as foes, and so do many northern lords. But they could be valuable allies if treated with respect. They've always wanted freedom, and if we can promise them lands to settle, they might fight beside us. Stannis' mouth twisted in distaste, but he did not dismiss the idea outright. I recall the Wildling King, Mance Rayder, had a certain dignity. He refused to kneel, and that cost him dearly. But perhaps his people can be swayed. If it means more spears against the dead, I will hear your counsel, Jon Stark. Robb gave Jon a look of approval. Good, he said softly. We all must put old hatreds aside. As the day wore on, the shape of a possible accord began to form. The North would remain functionally independent, led by House Stark, though the exact title might be something short of king if Stannis had his way. In return, the North would recognize Stannis' claim to the Iron Throne in a broader sense and come to his aid against the Lannisters. More importantly, they would coordinate armies to repel the supernatural threat from beyond the wall with shared command, supplies, and resources. It was a compromise that left no one entirely pleased, but might suffice to keep them from each other's throats. The Manderleys arranged quarters for Stannis' men within the city, a precarious arrangement that required the careful watch of guards to prevent any outbreak of violence between proud Northerners and stiff Baratheon soldiers. But the night passed without bloodshed, and that was something to be grateful for. Jon walked alone on the ramparts after darkness fell, gazing out over the frosty city, the black harbor beyond. Ghost prowled silently at his side. Flickers of torchlight glimmered below where men of two armies mingled uneasily. Above, the sky was a tapestry of brilliant stars. Winter's chill clung to the air, but Jon felt a strange warmth in his chest. He was Jon Stark now. He had found a path that allowed him to serve the realm, even if it broke his vows, perhaps fulfilling the vow's spirit more than if he had stayed at the wall. Footsteps approached. Jon turned to see Robb, the king in the north, his cloak wrapped tightly around his shoulders. "Hard to believe it's come to this," Robb said softly. "Striking bargains with Stannis Baratheon under the watchful eye of the Manderleys. I remember when we were boys, we dreamed of glory, of knighthood, of battles. And now that it's here, it's so grim." Jon placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "We do what we must," he replied. "Glory is a fool's hope in war. But if we can bring some measure of peace, if we can shield the north from the storms, both living and dead, then it might be worth it." Robb's gaze dropped to Ghost. The direwolf watched him silently, red eyes glimmering in the dark. "He's grown," Robb said, almost wistful. "We all have." A tremor crept into his voice. "I miss Grey Wind. I feel him sometimes in my dreams. I think of father, too. Of mother. Of Sansa and Arya, Bran and Rickon. The cost has been too high, Jon. If we can end this war, if we can unite even part of the realm so we stand a chance against the real threat, I'll do it." Jon heard the sorrow in his brother's words. He shared it. So many losses, so much pain. The memory of Ned Stark guided them still, urging them to hold true to honor, but also to practicality. "We'll do it," Jon promised. "Together." Robb nodded, swallowing hard. "Together," he echoed. In the days that followed, negotiations continued in a delicate dance. Stannis' men pressed for more concessions, and Robb's lords bristled. Melisandre's presence was an unnerving constant. She glided through White Harbor like a crimson shadow, leaving an undercurrent of whispered speculation in her wake. If she had some deeper design, it remained hidden for now. Jon took a leading role in bridging the gap, using what rapport he had built with Stannis at the wall and what trust he was gaining with the Northern Lords to keep tensions from boiling over. In quiet conversations with each side, he found areas of compromise, forging small agreements that built toward a bigger resolution. Ghost was never far, and the direwolf's silent watchfulness lent Jon an edge of authority that men often heeded. At last, a formal accord was drafted. It was not perfect, and it might only hold as long as both sides found it convenient. But it was enough to allow the armies to coordinate instead of clash. With winter tightening its grip, no one wanted a protracted war in the north. The final ceremony was tense, but it ended with Robb clasping Stannis' hand, both men standing in front of the Manderley sigil. "Let it be known," declared Stannis, "that I will not press my claim upon the north while we stand as allies against common foes. In return, House Stark shall uphold its pledge to unite northern forces under one banner, in support of the rightful crown should we prevail against the Lannisters and any other false kings. The specifics of the North's governance shall be debated once peace is won. But for now, we have war enough to occupy us." Robb inclined his head. "I agree. May the gods, both old and new, grant us victory." A ripple of guarded applause passed through the hall. Jon noticed a mixture of relief and lingering resentment among the Northern Lords. Many of them still wanted absolute independence. But for now, necessity demanded cooperation. Stannis' knights, too, displayed a reserved acceptance. Even they realized their king could not afford to fight another front in this endless war. After that, the business of war began in earnest. Scouts were dispatched to track any Ironborn movements. Squires rushed to gather supplies for the still lingering war with the Lannisters. Ravens flew to the Wall, to Winterfell, to scattered castles across the north, calling bannermen to muster. Stannis made arrangements to move his forces closer to the heart of the north, perhaps establishing a base nearer to Winterfell, an idea that unsettled some of Robb's lords, though they said nothing to his face. Yet a cautious optimism hovered over White Harbor. The city breathed a little easier, knowing it would not be sacked or occupied by a hostile southern army. The shops reopened. Refugees might find a modicum of stability for a time. The Manderleys went on about their business of fish and flour and shipping. War was still on the horizon, but for a few days, it seemed like the North had a fragile shield formed by mutual necessity. Jon spent those days conferring with the leaders of Stannis' host. He found common ground with some, friction with others. Ser Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, was polite, genuinely wanting peace. Jon liked him well enough. There was a sincerity to Davos that few others had. Melisandre, always watching, always silent except for the occasional cryptic comment, remained an enigma. He could not glean if she was content with this alliance or if she had darker designs of her own. On one particularly cold morning, as frost rimed the edges of the ships in the harbor, Jon found himself on the northern quay, watching the sea ice form intricate patterns on the water's surface. He breathed in the salt air, letting the chill settle over him, remembering the vantage from atop the wall. The sea of ice, the wasteland of white. He wondered how much time they truly had before the others advanced. A voice broke his reverie. "You stand as if you might ride away," came Melisandre's smooth tones. Jon turned, seeing her approach. She wore furs over her scarlet gown, though she seemed untroubled by the cold. Her red hair gleamed like embers against the gray backdrop of sea and sky. "Just thinking," Jon said. "Of the war to come?" He nodded. "Yes, and of how quickly men forget the true danger. We're squabbling over crowns and titles. The dead don't care about crowns or titles. They only care about turning us into more of them." She tilted her head, studying him. "You speak with wisdom beyond your years, Jon Stark. Yet men are men, with hearts that burn for power, for glory, for vengeance. It is only natural. The great other relishes such distractions." Her voice dropped lower. "But you must be ready. You have embraced your name, your birthright, yet greater trials await. The fires do not lie." Jon suppressed a shiver. "You see something else in your flames? You've hinted at it, but never said it outright." Her lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "Some truths are best discovered by the one who lives them. Prophecy can be a crutch or a prison if spoken too freely. Trust that I stand prepared to do what must be done to fight the darkness." She paused, then added almost gently, "I sense the wolf within you stirring. Do not shy from it, but do not let it consume you either." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jon with more questions than answers. Ghost sidled up to him, pressing a cold muzzle against his hand. Jon absently stroked the direwolf's fur, glancing once more at the horizon. In the following week, the armies began to move. Stannis led a portion of his men toward the Bar Rollins, hoping to secure the loyalty of House Dustin and others, while Robb gathered the bulk of the northern forces to head back to Winterfell. News arrived that the Boltons, uneasy allies at best, were fortifying the Drev fort, uncertain how to treat Robb's new arrangement with Stannis. Jon wanted to deal with them sooner rather than later. Ramsay Bolton already had a reputation for cruelty, and Roose Bolton was not a man to be trusted. Despite the complexities, for the moment the greatest immediate threat remained the Lannisters, who still held the south with the support of the Tyrells, and the Ironborn, who harassed the western and northern coasts. Robb planned to rally at Winterfell, resupply, then push west if the Ironborn threatened the Neck or the Rills again. Stannis might march for the Neck as well, or perhaps continue onto the Wall if word arrived of an attack from beyond. No single force was strong enough to handle all threats alone. They would need to rely on each other, if grudgingly. The day Jon and Robb departed White Harbor was as bitterly cold as any yet that season. Snow drifted from an iron-gray sky. The men trudged through the slush, leading horses loaded with supplies. Horns sounded a low note of farewell from the city walls. Lord Wyman Manderley and his knights saw them off with brave words about the North's resilience. Stannis and his Red Priestess had departed 3 days prior. The two armies would converge when the time was right, or so they'd agreed. Jon rode beside Robb at the head of the column, wearing a wolfskin cloak pinned with the Stark direwolf. He caught his reflection in a puddle of slush and half expected to see the bastard boy from Winterfell, awkward and overshadowed, looking back. Instead, he saw a man who had chosen a different path, forging a new identity in the fires of war. He tried not to think too far into the future or what final shape this alliance with Stannis might take. The dead were out there, gathering strength, and the living had precious little time to prepare. As they passed the gates and descended the road that curved along the White Knife River, the hush of falling snow seemed to press in around them. Horses snorted clouds of steam, men muttered to one another about the cold. But there was unity here, a sense that they rode with purpose. High above, a solitary raven circled, perhaps the forerunner of more messages to come. Jon glanced at Robb, who carried himself with a solemn dignity, cloak trailing behind him. Despite the burdens, he looked more at peace than Jon had seen him in a while. Winterfell awaits, Robb murmured. It's time we reclaimed our home for good. Jon nodded. He remembered the halls of Winterfell as they once were, warm, full of life, the heart of the North. Now they had the chance to restore some of that, however fleeting it might be in a time of war. And if the gods were kind, if any measure of fortune remained, they would rally the North and the Southern forces under Stannis, forging a united front in time to face the nightmares that marched under the cover of ice and death. With that thought weighing on his mind, Jon urged his horse to keep pace with Robb's, ghost trotting beside them, leaving fresh paw prints in the snow. The swirling flakes obscured the path ahead, but they rode on, resolute. For the moment, at least, the North was one step closer to unity, and there was a chance, just a chance, that men might stand together when the long night descended. Whether the chance would be enough was a question no one could answer. But for now, Jon gripped the reins, setting his face toward Winterfell, toward whatever fate awaited the new Stark in the old seat of power. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the roads and the fields, and still they rode forward, determined not to bend or break, but to endure. The column wound its way north under skies of dull pewter, a slow crawl of men and horses that stretched back through the snow-draped roads. Flakes drifted in lazy spirals, settling on cloaks already crusted with white. The pine forests shivered in the distance, their branches bowed beneath winter's weight. At times, the wind rose and sighed, carrying with it the echoes of distant howls, wolves, perhaps, or lonely wind devils swirling through the high passes. Jon rode near the front, a position he had not been accustomed to before Moat Cailin and White Harbor. So much had changed since then. Ghost paced beside him, the direwolf's breath misting in the cold, red eyes bright with alertness. Behind Jon trailed Robb Stark, the king in the north, and a cluster of banners that bore the snarling dire wolf of House Stark alongside lesser sigils of loyal houses. It still felt strange to Jon that no man in this northern army referred to him as Snow anymore. He was Jon Stark, brother to their king, trueborn by decree and recognized as such by many northern lords, if not all. That truth weighed heavily upon him, a forging of identity new and half-raw. Sometimes he feared he might wake to find it all undone, just as quickly as one woke from a dream. Ahead, a line of men tasked with clearing the road hacked at fallen branches, scooping snow away so the cart wheels might not mire. The supply wagons carried salted fish, hard bread, barley, oats, and every other vital provision the North could spare. The men whispered that winter would only grow fiercer, that these roads might soon be impassable. They pressed on anyway, drawn by the promise of home and by the knowledge that if they did not prepare for war, they would be easy prey when the snows reached the ramparts of Winterfell itself. Robb approached, reining in his horse to ride side by side with Jon. Even in the gray hush of the midday gloom, the king in the north cut an imposing figure. A cloak of wolf fur, pinned with the bronze crown at his shoulder, spilled over his broad shoulders. His face seemed lined with an exhaustion that never fully lifted, and though he was but a few years older than Jon, at times he appeared a decade older. Yet there was a steadiness in his eyes that gave Jon hope, a look that said Robb meant to see their mission through, come what may. "How fares the vanguard?" Robb asked, nodding toward the distant figures plodding on. They were crossing a particularly narrow stretch of road that sloped down into a glen before snaking back up toward open fields. "They're making slow but steady progress," Jon answered. "Some streams have frozen over in this cold, but the ice is thin in places. The men are wary of crossing. One lost a horse to an icy patch, but the horse managed to scramble out before it broke a leg." He paused, glancing back at the rank and file trailing them. "No casualties aside from bruised pride." Robb nodded. "At least that's something. We can't afford to lose good horses." His expression turned thoughtful. "I've been thinking about this approach to Winterfell. The roads beyond might be even worse, less traveled, more drifted. But we can't simply hole up in White Harbor all winter. I'm anxious to see Winterfell restored. As am I." Jon let the wind sting his cheeks for a moment, noting the wide fields that lay ahead. "The men are in decent spirits, considering." But I overheard talk, some worry about the Boltons. They say the flayed man might be on the march, or that Ramsay hunts men in the forests for sport. Jon's voice grew taut with distaste. I'm not sure how much is rumor, but I would not put such things past him. Robb's jaw clenched. The Boltons remain a problem. Roose pretends at loyalty, he did once swear to me, but the Frey alliance complicates everything. Word is that Roose is at the Dread Fort fortifying his seat. Ramsay is a monster by all accounts. I have half a mind to order them subdued, but that would take men we may not spare. He exhaled, white wisps trailing. One thing at a time. Winterfell first. If we hold the ancient seat of our house, that alone will draw the rest of the north to us. Jon inclined his head. Yes, your grace. Robb shot him a faint look of mild reprimand. I told you, call me Robb when we're alone or near enough. I can't stand all this pomp among my own kin. A slight smile tugged at Jon's lips. Very well, Robb. They said little more for a time, letting the hush of falling snow envelop them. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the crunch of hooves, the distant calls of outriders scouting the perimeter. Jon found himself lost in thought, remembering how Winterfell had looked the last time he'd seen it, long before the war tore the realm apart. He had parted ways with his family just after choosing the Night's Watch, and the halls had been warm with the smell of bread and the sound of steel on steel from the training yard. Now, the castle was rumored to be partially burned, its walls blackened, its towers damaged. Reclaiming it was not just a matter of opening the gates and stepping inside. Rebuilding would be an endeavor. Still, for all the heartbreak that might await them in the ashes, Jon felt a pull in his heart. Winterfell. Their father's seat, the place where they had all been children once, Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon, and even Jon, though he'd never quite belonged. He wondered if he might feel differently now, returning as Jon Stark. It was a notion as intimidating as it was exhilarating. Eventually, the line of march halted as evening deepened. Camps sprang up in the shelter of a stand of ancient oaks, their branches groaning under clumps of snow. Fires flickered in stone circles, tents rose, men trudged back and forth collecting wood. Jon made a circuit of the camp with Robb, checking the perimeter and ensuring the watch was properly posted. Sentries braced against the cold, spears in hand, eyes watchful. They all knew better than to grow careless, not in these times. If not the Boltons, it might be outlaws or roving bands of Ironborn. The north was large and often empty, but no one forgot the threat of ambush. At last, they found a small circle of tents near the center where Great Jon Umber, Galbart Glover, and other lords had gathered. The smell of stew, a mixture of salted pork and carrots, hung in the frigid air. Robb beckoned Jon to follow him inside the largest tent. Within, warmth and the low glow of a single lantern greeted them. A battered table had been set up, a crude map of the north pinned with daggers at its corners to keep it from rolling. Jon recognized the broad outlines of the territory from the many hours he'd spent at Castle Black's library, poring over old charts. Galbart Glover stood on one side of the table. He had a neatly trimmed beard flecked with gray and wore his house colors, red and silver. Opposite him, Great Jon Umber loomed, tall as a small giant, his thick arms folded across his chest. Both men dipped their heads when Robb entered. Your Grace, Glover said in a subdued voice. His attention shifted to Jon, an inclination of acknowledgement. My Lord Stark. Jon still stiffened at the title, but he managed a nod. My Lord Glover. Great Jon thumped his fist on the table. We were just discussing whether to aim for the King's Road or cut through the woods. The direct route might be easier for the wagons, but if the Boltons or any other foe lies in wait, we'd have little cover. He scowled. And the King's Road is wide enough for an ambush by cavalry. But this damned weather complicates everything. Robb moved closer and dragged a finger across the map's lines, searching for vantage points. We've outriders patrolling ahead. If there's a trap, they should spot signs. I'd rather not deviate too far from the main road. Any day we lose to side routes is another day the Boltons might move or the Ironborn might push deeper inland. Let's keep to the King's Road unless we have firm intelligence of danger. Glover and Umber both bowed their heads, conceding. Robb studied the map a moment longer, and a heavy silence settled. Jon used the lull to sharpen his own perspective. They would pass the area near the last river, then skirt into the region known for scattered farmsteads. Not so far from the dreaded Dread Fort either. He wondered if the Boltons watched from the shadows, quietly calculating. Any word from Stannis? Great Jon asked with a snort. He's probably half frozen by now if he's riding through the Barrowlands. Robb's features remained impassive. No word. We left White Harbor under the assumption that he would continue pressing for alliances among the lesser houses or move east if the Ironborn threatened Deepwood Moat again. Jon and I negotiated the best we could. Now we have to see if he holds to it. Or if the red woman told him something in her flames, muttered Glover warily, as though the idea of that priestess's sorcery unnerved him. He rubbed his hands over the lantern's weak glow. "I'll be happier when we reach Winterfell. At least we'll have walls around us." Robb offered a nod. "Go on with the normal watches. Double them if you see any sign of unrest. Let's see what the Outriders find in the morning." With that he pivoted, gesturing for Jon to follow him back outside. The cold greeted them like a slap. Snow had begun again, heavier this time, swirling in gusts. Torchlight gleamed on the freshly falling flakes, and beyond the perimeter, the darkness seemed impenetrable. Robb lingered by the central fire, calling for a bowl of stew from a passing cook. Jon did the same, warming his hands around the crude wooden bowl, letting the steam waft against his face. Men huddled around fires, complaining good-naturedly about the cold, the journey, the rations. Soldiers of houses Mormont, Serwyn, Tallheart, and many others were interspersed throughout the camp. The once proud cavalry of House Stark was somewhat reduced but still formidable, their horses blanketed in furs. Those mounts would be crucial for any pitched battle on open ground. Jon studied the men in the nearest ring of firelight. Their shoulders sagged, their faces gaunt with the strain of war and winter. He felt the creeping sense of responsibility that had grown since Robb had named him a trueborn Stark, a sense that these men's lives lay in his hands as much as in Robb's. These were not mere black brothers who had volunteered or been conscripted for the Watch's cause. These were free Northerners, proud scions of old houses and humble farm boys alike, all fighting because they believed in the Stark name. Jon tried to steady himself with the knowledge that the best he could do for them was remain vigilant and keep forging alliances. If the North survived, it would be because they all stood together. After the meal, Jon found a patch of ground for his tent, situating it near the center. Ghost padded inside with him, curling up on the thick blankets set on the frozen ground. The wind rattled the canvas now and then, and through the flap, Jon glimpsed the drifting flakes that seemed endless. He thought of the others creeping in the far north, an unremitting tide of death that would not care about the King's Road, the Dreadfort, or who wore what crown. Sighing, he lay back and closed his eyes, letting the cold lull him into a restless sleep. His dreams were filled with swirling visions of black shapes moving across a snowy field, skeletal hands clutching at swords rimed with frost. A dead direwolf howled in the distance. Then he was in Winterfell's courtyard, every stone blackened and broken, blood seeping from the cracks. Shadows wreathed the corners, and among them, a figure in red turned to look at him with eyes like embers. Melisandre? He could not be sure. The dream shifted again, to a flicker of the old crypts beneath Winterfell, where the statues of the ancient Stark kings seemed to whisper secrets he could not understand. He woke in the gray pre-dawn, heart pounding. Ghost was on his feet, ears perked. Something had stirred OU. Sighed. Jon rose, donned cloak and boots, and stepped out to find the camp half-stirring as well. A half-dozen riders had just returned from scouting, horses lathered with sweat despite the cold. One scout dismounted and saluted. "My lord, your grace," he called out to Robb and Jon. The man's cheeks were flushed from the cold, and his breath came in gasps. "We found tracks near the old mill by the river. Could be a large party, at least a score, maybe more. They circled around the hill and vanished into the woods. We suspect they might be Bolton riders or Sellswords." Robb's mouth tightened. "Not Ironborn?" The scout shook his head. "Didn't see any sign of reavers. No scuttled ships up the river. If it's not Bolton men, it could be bandits. Either way, they might be looking to test our strength." Robb glanced to Jon, who spoke quietly. "We could send a small force to flush them out or see if they intend to approach. But we risk stumbling into a trap." "We can't just ignore it," Robb said grimly. "The rest of our route crosses that stretch of road. If they're Boltons, we need to remind them the North has a king." By first light, the camp was abuzz. A small detachment of cavalry and foot, perhaps 100 men, rode out to investigate while the rest of the army packed up. Jon elected to accompany them. Robb decided to remain with the main column. The king's place was arguably with the bulk of his forces, especially if there was a threat of a larger engagement. But Jon felt a pull to see firsthand who lurked in those woods. Ghost, eager for movement, padded silently at Jon's side. They traveled several miles north, guided by the same scouts. Snowdrifts piled along the trees, and the king's road grew more rugged, pitted with ice. The day brightened somewhat, though the sun was little more than a dull glow behind clouds. Jon led the vanguard, scanning the terrain for any sign of watchers. The detachment behind him consisted mainly of tall-limbed Umbers and lean-faced Cerwyn men, all hardened by weeks of war. Their breath steamed as they trudged along, swords half-drawn. A hush lay over the wood as they neared the old mill. Its timbers sagged beneath caked snow. The water wheel was frozen solid in the partly iced-over stream. Jon raised a hand, motioning for quiet. He and a trio of outriders slipped off their horses and crept closer. Ghost slunk alongside him, nose twitching. The tracks were clear enough in the fresh snow. Horse prints, boots. More than a dozen, maybe two. The trail led around the back of the mill, then vanished into a thick copse of pine. Jon crouched, gloved hand brushing the nearest print. It was deep, likely indicating riders. He glanced at his companions and signaled for them to remain cautious. They followed in a loose column, eyes sweeping the pine boughs overhead. Now and then, snow fell from a branch, the sudden noise making hearts jolt. They advanced another 100 paces until Ghost stopped, ears flicking forward, muzzle raised to catch a scent. Jon froze, flattening himself to a trunk. He scanned the stillness. Something was out there. Suddenly, the woods erupted with motion, shapes in pale gray and dull leathers darting from behind the trees, crossbows raised. Bolton men. One of the outriders roared as a bolt whistled past, burying itself in a trunk. Another found its mark in a Cerwyn rider's throat. He toppled from the saddle, blood spraying onto snow. Jon reacted on instinct. Shields up, he barked, though few had time to comply. He scrambled behind a trunk, hand going to Longclaw's hilt. At his side, Ghost snarled, white fur bristling. Umbers rushed forward with axes and swords, trying to close the distance so the crossbows wouldn't be as deadly. More bolts hissed through the air. One clanged off a shield with a hollow ring, another tore into a horse's flank. Jon flung himself into motion, crossing the ground in a burst of speed. He glimpsed a Bolton man stooping to reload. The sigil of the flayed man was sewn into his cloak, half hidden in the swirl of snow. Jon felt a cold fury welling inside him. Bolton men on Stark soil, armed and ready to kill. He closed the gap just as the man raised his crossbow, and with a swift slash of Longclaw, Jon knocked the weapon aside. The man tried to draw a short sword, but Ghost lunged, fangs flashing, dragging the Bolton soldier down. Jon struck once, finishing it cleanly. Red droplets stained the snow, glaring in the pale morning light. All around, steel clashed as the smaller Bolton party realized the Stark detachment was larger than they'd thought. Some broke and ran deeper into the trees. Others fought savagely, cursing and hacking. Jon saw an Umber man go down with a crossbow bolt in his eye. Another Umber sank his axe into the Bolton's shoulder with a roar of fury. A shape barreled into Jon from the side, nearly toppling him. He heard a hiss of anger and recognized the sneering face of a Bolton soldier, lips peeled back in hate. The man swung a flail, spike ball whistling dangerously close. Jon pivoted, Longclaw up, deflecting with a jar that rattled his arms. The man swung again, pressing close, saliva flying from his mouth as he snarled. Jon reeled back, found stable footing, and lunged. His Valyrian steel bit through the man's chest, emerging on the other side. The Bolton soldier sagged with a choked gasp. Breathing hard, Jon yanked Longclaw free, scanning the melee. It was mostly over. Bolton men lay strewn across the snow. A few were pinned by Umbers or Cerwyn men. One or two had tried to flee, only to be run down by riders who circled around the perimeter. Jon realized his left arm was stinging. A shallow cut along the bicep seeped blood, but nothing dire. Secure the survivors, Jon ordered once he regained his voice. The outriders and foot soldiers fanned out, dragging moaning Bolton men into a half-circle. Ghost prowled, muzzle stained red. A quick head count revealed they had lost 4 men. A half-dozen were wounded, some more seriously than others. The Bolton party had fared far worse. Most lay dead or dying. Only 4 or 5 lived. Among them, a young man in ragged leathers glared defiantly. One of the Cerwyn men kicked him behind the knees, forcing him down. Jon sheathed Longclaw. "Who leads you?" he asked quietly. "Roose or Ramsay?" The Bolton soldier spat. "Ramsay Bolton is our lord. He hunts the traitor king in the north." The soldier's gaze raked over Jon with venomous intent. "He knows you're on the move, Stark. You'll find no welcome at Winterfell. It belongs to House Bolton now." A wave of fury swept through Jon, sharper than the cold. But he held himself in check. "You're mistaken," he said. "Winterfell belongs to House Stark. If your lord thinks otherwise, he'll learn differently soon enough. Your father's bones feed the hounds, bastard." The soldier sneered. "And the king in the north is nothing but a dead pup soon to." An Umber soldier slammed the hilt of his sword into the man's mouth, silencing him with a spray of blood and broken teeth. The soldier crumpled, still alive but groaning. Jon forced down the red haze that threatened to blind him. He needed to think clearly. He turned to the nearest outrider. "Strip them of weapons. Bind them. We'll bring them back to the main host for Robb's judgment. If there are any more stragglers in the woods, see that they're taken or killed." His men moved swiftly to obey. The set of their shoulders and the tension in their faces told Jon all he needed to know. They hated the Boltons. The flayed man had betrayed House Stark once before, and now these raiders were proud to announce their master's name. There could be no question that open conflict with the Boltons was brewing. Jon surveyed the aftermath. The ground was churned slush, stained red in places, footprints and horse tracks tangling. A few men were rummaging through the dead Bolton soldiers' pouches, looking for anything of value or any sign of orders. One found a scrap of parchment bearing the Dreadfort seal, though it contained nothing but a vague mention of scouting movements. Ghost sniffed around, tail low, occasionally growling as he passed the moaning wounded. Jon caught the direwolf's scruff gently. "Easy, Ghost. We have them in hand." He was angry too, but there was no sense in letting the men be torn apart now that they were captured. Once the surviving Boltons were bound, the Stark detachment regrouped. They built a rough sled for the severely wounded men, both friend and foe, and prepared for the trek back. The dead would be hauled as well, those that belonged to the north, so they could be granted proper rights under the eyes of the old gods. As for the Bolton corpses, Jon doubted they'd be missed. Still, he ordered them placed in a shallow ditch. The men, exhausted, performed their tasks in sullen silence. He led the return march, thoughts roiling with the knowledge that the Dreadfort had drawn first blood. Soon the entire north might face an internal war. That was the last thing Robb needed, given how precarious their alliance with Stannis already was. Still, the Boltons had chosen to strike, and they would not let it lie. Jon's gut churned with a sense of inevitability. If Ramsay Bolton had marched into Winterfell or claimed it, the king's road ahead would not be straightforward. They met the main column as it was breaking camp. Men gathered quickly to see the captured Bolton soldiers. Robb approached at a brisk pace, taking in the scene with dark eyes. "So it's true then?" he asked, voice low. "Bolton men here?" Jon nodded. "They attacked without hesitation. We lost 4. They lost more." He indicated the bruised and bloodied captives, who knelt in the slush. One spat at Robb's feet, only to receive a gauntlet fist to the temple from an Umber guard. Robb's jaw tightened. "And they claim loyalty to Ramsay." One of the prisoners gave a watery chuckle, blood running down his chin. "Ramsay Bolton, rightful warden of the north," he said thickly, eyes gleaming with malice. "Your day is done, dog. The Dreadfort stands stronger than." His words ended in a strangled cry as an enraged soldier struck him in the back with a spear haft. Robb raised a hand to hold the men off. "Bind them to a tree," the king ordered softly. "They can stay there until we decide their fate." Jon recognized the suppressed anger in Robb, the same anger that lived in him. The men dragged the Bolton soldiers away. Some among the northern ranks muttered curses, calling for vengeance. The tension was a tangible thing, rippling through the host like a cold wind. Robb drew Jon aside. "If Ramsay has men this far out," Robb said quietly, "he might control Winterfell already. He may have a garrison there." "Then we'll have to lay siege," Jon said. The words felt heavy. "Unless we can rally enough support to storm the castle." Robb nodded grimly. "One way or another, I mean to see that bastard out of our home." He paused, exhaling a breath that hung in the air. "I'm sorry about your men. For more dead, more lives that might have been spared had we not been at war with our own." Jon hesitated before speaking. "I doubt there's any peace to be made with Ramsay. If Roose were in charge, maybe we could treat. But Ramsay is known for cruelty. He won't yield lightly." A flicker of memory passed through Robb's eyes, perhaps recalling Theon Greyjoy's betrayal, or the news that had come from the Dreadfort in the past. "Then we won't ask him to yield. The North is done tolerating the Boltons." He glanced at Jon, expression set. "We press on, gather more men from the smaller houses, then march on Winterfell. We'll drive him out or starve him out." Jon nodded, though a part of him was uneasy. Another siege in the heart of winter, with the others looming beyond the horizon. Felt like every path led to more death. But the Boltons would not just disappear. And so the host resumed its march, more wary now. Scouts were redoubled, the outriders told to scour every wood and thicket for further ambush. The men marched in tighter formation, archers at the ready, nerves strung taut. For several days they wound through the thick pine forests, the air so cold it seemed to scald the lungs. Snow fell relentlessly, sometimes in gentle drifts, other times in furious squalls. The land sloped and dipped, meandering across broad fields where old farmsteads lay deserted. Their roofs collapsed under the weight of ice. The only sign of life was the occasional raven perched on a fence post or a fox slinking through the undergrowth. Late one afternoon, the outriders returned with news of a small settlement ahead, near the banks of a half-frozen river. The men approached warily, half expecting another ambush. Instead, they found battered villagers who emerged from huts and lean-to shelters, wide-eyed at the sight of the king in the North's banners. They were gaunt with hunger, many missing fingers or toes to frostbite. Robb and Jon dismounted to speak with an old woman who huddled in a threadbare cloak. She told them that Bolton men had ridden through weeks earlier, demanding supplies, threatening to burn their huts if they refused. The villagers had little to offer but a few sacks of grain and salted fish, so the Bolton men took that and departed, leaving them with nearly nothing. Now they barely survived on what meager game they could trap. She fell at Robb's feet, weeping with relief that House Stark had returned. Jon knelt to help her up, heart lancing with pity. "We'll see you have a share of our rations," he said, though he knew supplies were tight. He glanced at Robb, who nodded in grim approval. "Thank you, my lord," the woman rasped, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Bless you. The Starks always cared for their people. The Boltons." She broke off in a tremor of fear. From a distance, the rest of the villagers watched as a small group of soldiers unloaded some sacks of grain. Robb dispatched a few men to break into one of the huts and build a large fire, so at least the old woman and the children might warm themselves. It was a minor reprieve in a vast, unrelenting winter. In that moment, Jon realized that for all the talk of kings and alliances, the heart of the North lay in these scattered hamlets, in the simple folk who could not flee the snow. If the Boltons continued to prey on them, and House Stark did nothing, then no moral high ground remained. Even if war against Ramsay risked thinning their own strength, there was no choice. The North had to be reclaimed. They left the villagers with what help they could spare, pressing onward. Each day felt like a forced march into deeper gloom, but every step brought them closer to Winterfell. Snowdrifts sometimes forced them to detour. Once the column halted by a frozen lake as men debated whether the ice was thick enough to cross. Ultimately, Robb decided they would ride around, not willing to risk plunging wagons into icy water. The route around added a day or more to their travel, fueling the men's exhaustion. At night, the wind cut like a knife, howling across the open fields. Tents rustled and threatened to blow away. Men cursed the cold and huddled together for warmth. Jon saw the toll in the hollow eyes of the camp followers, the coughing children, the blackened stumps where men's fingers had frozen and been amputated. War in the North during winter was not just a matter of swords and arrows. Survival itself became an enemy. At last, they came within sight of the outer farmland that ringed Winterfell. Empty fields, half-ruined barns. The road led through a small copse of ash trees, their bark pale as bones. Beyond that, low hills gave way to the seat of House Stark. Jon's heart pounded at the thought that soon they would crest a rise and see the castle's familiar silhouette. He tried to steady himself, remembering that the story said Winterfell had been badly burned when Theon took it, that further damage might have been done since. Robb called for a halt on a hillock overlooking the farmland. Through the swirling snow, a distant shape loomed, the towers of Winterfell black against the white sky, rising from the horizon like a memory half-forgotten. For a moment, none of them spoke. The men near the front stared in silent awe as though seeing the soul of the North laid bare. Some muttered prayers. Others rested hands on hearts or weapons, steeling themselves. Jon felt a piercing nostalgia for the boy he had been, standing in the training yard with a wooden sword while Robb grinned at him. Now he returned as Jon Stark, recognized and legitimized, but with war at his back. A horn call echoed from somewhere near the gates, thin and distant. Jon narrowed his eyes, focusing. Through the haze of snow, he glimpsed small figures moving along the battlements. If the Boltons had men here, they had likely already seen the Stark banners. Jon exchanged a look with Robb, whose face was set in cold determination. "So it begins," Robb murmured. They advanced slowly. The farmland gave way to a wide clearing. Jon could see broken sections of the old wooden outer palisades, charred in places. The main walls of Winterfell still stood, though they bore blackened scars. The gatehouse was closed, and on the ramparts, shapes in fur cloaks peered down. Jon's chest tightened, suspecting Bolton men behind those walls. The question was whether they possessed the men and arms to hold the castle against an entire host. Robb signaled, and a small group of riders moved forward beneath a white flag. Parley, came the shout, carrying eerily through the hush. "We come under a flag of truce to speak with those who hold Winterfell." For a heartbeat, there was no reply. Then a voice boomed from the ramparts. "The castle belongs to Ramsay Bolton, Warden of the North by the grace of King Tommen Baratheon. We do not treat with traitors or usurpers. Leave or die." A low rumble spread through Robb's forces. Jon heard men muttering curses, some spitting on the ground. Robb edged his horse forward, raising his voice. "I am Robb Stark, son of Eddard Stark, rightful lord of these lands. You have no claim here. Surrender Winterfell and I will grant you mercy." Silence from the walls. Then that same voice answered, mocking. "Your father is dead, your brother is dead, and you'll follow soon enough. Winterfell is mine, by the order of Lord Ramsay. Turn back." Robb shook his head, nostrils flaring. "So be it," he said quietly, turning his horse around. Jon and the other riders followed him. Once they returned to the main host, Robb's voice turned steely. "We may camp. They have enough men to hold the walls. There's no sign of them opening the gates. We'll have to starve them out or breach by force." "Great," Jon Umber spat into the snow. "Then let's do it. I've waited long enough to teach those flaying bastards a lesson." "It won't be quick," Robb said. "They have provisions, presumably enough to last weeks, even months, if the Boltons prepared well. We must be prepared for a siege in winter. If the others have taught us anything, it's that we may have little time before greater threats descend. But we cannot leave Winterfell in their hands. It's too great a symbol, too crucial a seat. If we abandon it, the North will fracture." Jon silently agreed. The question was how to proceed. A direct assault might cost hundreds of lives. Winterfell's walls, even damaged, were thick, built to withstand centuries of wear. The Boltons were cunning, apt to rain arrows, pitch, or any other vile trick on the besiegers. A long siege in winter threatened to drain the Stark forces of food and morale. Yet what alternative was there? The men set to building a rudimentary siege camp a safe distance from the walls. They dug defensive ditches, posted archers behind makeshift barricades, and set up tents in scattered clusters. Snow continued to fall, sometimes drifting high around the tents. Small fires burned amid piles of slush, never giving enough warmth. Jon saw to the arrangement of outriders in a ring around the perimeter so no Bolton riders could slip past them under cover of night. That evening, a grim hush lay over the camp. Ghosts prowled the edges, sniffing at the shadows. Despite the relative bustle, men hammering stakes, forging arrowheads, cooking thin stew in battered cauldrons, there was an undercurrent of dread. Winterfell stood so close, its broken towers silhouetted against the sky, reminding them all of what was at stake. From time to time, a distant shout or torchlight flicker on the ramparts would catch Jon's attention. Bolton men, no doubt, keeping watch or tormenting some poor soul. Robb called a war council in a large command tent near the center of the encampment. Jon joined him along with Great Jon Umber, Galbart Glover, and a handful of other lord commanders. They stood around a table strewn with maps of Winterfell showing potential weaknesses in the walls. In truth, the castle was not easily undermined, and the men who had scouted earlier reported that the interior gate was still strong, the causeway clear of debris. The main damage from Theon's occupation and the subsequent sack was mostly in the Great Keep and the Burn Tower. It's possible we could try the old tunnel system beneath the walls, Galbart suggested quietly, tracing a line on the map. Some say there are hidden ways in and out used by Brandon the Burner or other ancient Starks. But no one living seems to know them well. Robb shook his head. If we had weeks to search, maybe? But that's not certain, and it could lead our men into a trap. No, we hold the siege. Cut off their supply lines. If the Boltons have any illusions of reinforcing from the Dread Fort, our outriders will warn us. We should also keep an eye on the approach from the west in case any Ironborn reavers get bold enough to sail upriver. Let them freeze themselves if they try. Great John thumped a fist on the table. Aye, so be it. We'll let them starve, and if they sally forth, we'll cut them down. He bared his teeth in a wolfish grin. I've waited to taste Bolton blood for a long while. John folded his arms, considering. We need to be cautious with our own stores. Our men can't starve for the sake of a siege. We have to gather supplies from the outlying areas. That means escorting foraging parties, keeping them protected. He glanced at Robb. Even if it's just rabbits and roots, it's something. Robb sighed. Yes, see to that, John. Put together men who can search the area for any hidden caches. We must plan for the long haul. A hush settled. They all knew how precarious a winter siege could be. In the North's history, it had sometimes spelled disaster for the besiegers as often as for the besieged. Night wrapped them in a deeper chill, and the lords drifted away to see to their tasks. John lingered with Robb in the tent. His brother sank onto a rough stool, rubbing his temple. I had hoped we might retake Winterfell without throwing ourselves into a siege, Robb admitted. But that was wishful thinking. John crouched by the brazier's modest warmth. We should send out ravens. Let the other northern lords know we lay siege to Winterfell. Perhaps they'll rally to help or at least send supplies. And we might also send word to Stannis. I don't like the idea of southern armies setting foot here, but the truth is we share a common enemy in the Boltons. Stannis hates traitors. He might assist if only to gain further favor in the north. Robb studied him, the flicker of the brazier casting shadows over his face. Do you think he would come? He's pinned in the south or the east, for all we know. Marching all this way for a siege in deep winter. Stannis has proven he's willing to march through the cold. And he despises the Dreadfort for betraying the crown. If we extend an offer that cements our alliance further, he might see advantage in helping us dethrone the Boltons once and for all. Robb stared at the tent wall as if seeing some distant future. We're in an alliance of convenience, he said at last. Still, you might be right. If we can topple the Boltons, Stannis might see it as a boon. The realm is fractured enough without the flayed man sowing chaos. Yes, let's send a raven. See if he'll come. John nodded. They would attempt it. Still, a part of him worried about the optics of allowing a southern king, even one with whom they had made a precarious peace, within the very seat of House Stark. Northern pride ran deep. But they had come too far to let pride alone guide them. They needed to end this quickly or risk losing men and morale to the snows. They parted ways for the night, and John returned to his tent. He found Ghost curled up outside, dusted with fresh snow, watchful. The direwolf rose and padded in with him, pressing close for warmth. John tried to sleep, but rest eluded him for hours. Each time he closed his eyes, he imagined an image of Ramsay Bolton on the battlements, smirking, or heard the rasping voice of that Bolton soldier telling them to leave or die. He thought of the old days at Winterfell, how he and Robb had raced around the courtyard on a crisp morning, how father had taught them the values of honor and mercy. Now, to reclaim that memory, they might have to unleash violence and destruction. Finally, exhaustion claimed him. His dreams were full of the same haunted images that had plagued him for weeks, whites in the snow, the distant call of a horn, the red sorceress who flickered between illusions of fire and ice. When he woke, dawn was a gray line on the horizon. The siege had begun. Men milled about, preparing fortifications, raising palisades, setting up archery positions. On the ramparts, John could see Bolton soldiers likewise pacing, occasionally loosing an arrow at any Stark man who ventured too close. The days that followed were a test of endurance. The Stark-led host circled Winterfell on all sides, establishing a blockade that prevented any supply wagons from reaching the castle. Scouts ranged out to intercept couriers or stray Bolton patrols. Occasionally, the defenders mounted a sortie from a postern gate, clashing with the watchers on the perimeter. Each skirmish cost lives. In one such clash, an arrow caught Galbart Glover in the shoulder, forcing him to recuperate in a crowded field tent. Another saw an Umber captain cut down by a mounted Bolton knight. The shallow ditches around the camp soon filled with bodies. Winterfell and truly had them in its icy grasp. Night after night, the temperature plummeted. Men stamped their feet, cursed their luck, and huddled under furs. They roasted whatever game they could find, hares, squirrels, even crows on occasion if they were desperate enough. Food stores ran low, though the supply wagons from White Harbor continued to arrive for now. The biggest fear was that winter storms might soon block the roads entirely, isolating them. Meanwhile, inside Winterfell, the enemy presumably had hearths, storerooms, and some measure of comfort behind thick walls. A few nights, the defenders lit braziers on the ramparts, taunting the besiegers with the glow of warmth. Jon saw their silhouettes against the orange flame, images of men who might be smirking at them. The tension in the siege lines grew taut, men muttering that they should storm the walls before starvation took them. But Robb held them in check, refusing to sacrifice lives on a desperate assault. Scouts reported that the dread fort remained quiet, with no large forces on the move. No word came from Stannis. The days stretched on, bleak and colorless, until the sense of time blurred. The men passed idle hours by telling stories of Ned Stark's just rule or speculating on whether the others might sweep over the wall at any moment. Some prayed to the old gods, carving new faces in the rough-barked trees near camp. Others fell into a grim silence, eyes haunted by the unrelenting cold. Jon did not remain idle. He personally led foraging parties into the surrounding countryside, searching deserted farms for anything left behind. Once they found a hidden cellar with jars of pickled beets and dried venison. Another time, they stumbled on an abandoned orchard, its fruit long fallen and rotted. Nonetheless, a few windfalls provided some sustenance. The men came to appreciate any morsel that wasn't hardtack or stale bread. On one such excursion, Jon's group ran into a small cluster of Bolton soldiers near a half-ruined holdfast. The ensuing fight was short and furious. Ghost tore out the throat of one man, and Jon killed another with a single blow from long claw. The survivors fled. Jon surveyed the aftermath with a numb acceptance. War had become this constant drumbeat of skirmishes and survival. There would be no relief until Winterfell was free again. When the third week of siege dawned, the weather took a bitter turn. An icy wind whipped across the plain, piling snow in drifts that reached men's chests. Many of the siege lines became nearly impassable. Men waded through waist-deep snow to gather water from half-frozen streams. The Bolton defenders all but vanished from the walls. The watchers saw smoke rising from the chimneys within, evidence they were huddled around their hearths. Robb called a council in his tent. "We can't keep this up indefinitely," he said, voice tight. "Even if the Boltons run low on supplies, they're safe behind those walls. We, on the other hand, have to brave this cold every day. Our men grow sick, frostbitten. Food is scarce. Morale is failing." Great Jon Umber rumbled a curse. "Then let's scale the walls in force. I'll lead the first wave myself." "You'd lose half your men in the attempt," Robb retorted. "And for what? The Boltons would pick us off from the ramparts." "No, we need another tactic." Jon, standing near the brazier, spoke hesitantly. "We could focus on sabotage, try to block or destroy any wells within the castle if there's a way. But we have no infiltration route. The gates are sealed, the walls patrolled. Even the old godwood entrance is reinforced, from what the scouts report." Robb pressed his lips together. "We've sent ravens to all the loyal houses. Some have responded with promises of men or supplies, but they won't arrive overnight. We're isolated." His tone betrayed the frustration that bubbled beneath. "I had hoped Stannis might answer. Where's he? In the name of all the gods, we gave him everything he asked to fight for the North." Before anyone could reply, a man pushed through the tent flaps, a Stark guardsman with cheeks red from the cold. He knelt stiffly. "Your Grace, we have riders approaching from the south. We're not sure who they are, but they bear some sort of royal banner." Robb's eyes lit with cautious hope. Could it be Stannis? Jon exchanged a look with Robb. "Let's see." They hurried outside, shivering as the wind knifed through them. Mounting their horses, they rode out with a small guard, leaving the main lines to remain on alert in case of treachery. Snow whipped at their faces, half blinding them. But soon Jon saw the flicker of banners on a distant ridge. Sure enough, a golden stag on a field of black crowned. Beneath it, a smaller banner with the red flame of the Lord of Light. A group of about 50 riders came into view, in the center of which a familiar tall figure in black armor rode a coal-dark destrier. Stannis Baratheon. At his side, the red-robed Melisandre rode as well, her scarlet hair whipping about her face like a living flame in the wind. Jon's chest tensed with a mixture of relief and wariness. Why had Stannis come with so small a retinue? Perhaps his main force was strung out behind him, or perhaps he had left them somewhere else. Robb led the way forward. The two columns met in the swirling snow, horses stamping. Stannis's expression was pinched, his face more gaunt than Jon remembered. The lines of strain around his mouth told of a hard journey. He inclined his head, but there was no warmth in his greeting. "Robb Stark," he said. "King in the north, so they call you." Robb straightened. "Stannis Baratheon, rightful king of Westeros." The words sounded like a forced courtesy, but he offered them nonetheless. "I see you've come north after all." Stannis snorted. "I received your raven. The Boltons are traitors to the realm, serving the Lannister boy. I had half a mind to leave you to your siege and see which side starved first, but my sense of duty overcame my annoyance. The north will never be settled while the Boltons hold the castle. If we mean to unite against the true threat beyond the wall, we must cast them down." Melisandre's voice came strangely melodic amidst the wind's howl. "The flames have shown us the ruin that comes if men do not stand together. We come to aid you, Jon Stark." Her red eyes found his, and something in her gaze unsettled him. "You will have need of our strength." Jon glanced at Robb. This was precarious. Many men in the Stark camp would not welcome southern interlopers meddling in their internal war. But necessity was necessity. "Your help is appreciated," Jon managed. "But how large is your host?" "Larger than what you see," Stannis replied curtly. "We have 5,000 men in total trailing behind us. I rode ahead with my vanguard to speak to you. The rest will arrive within days, though the snow slows them. I have horse, foot, and some siege equipment as well, if needed." Robb's eyes flicked to Winterfell's ramparts, just visible through the swirling snow. "It is needed," he said bluntly. "We can't break the walls without heavy siege towers or catapults. We have only a fraction here." Stannis nodded. "Very well. We will set our men to the task as soon as they arrive. I trust you will honor your side of the bargain. Once the Boltons are done, I expect the North's cooperation in subduing the Lannisters and any other pretenders." A taut silence followed. Robb weighed the words. "We'll do what must be done for the realm. The winter does not allow for petty feuds while the others gather strength." Stannis's mouth twitched in what might have been a flicker of agreement. "You speak sense. We freeze out here while the dead bide their time. Let's finish this quickly." The two kings exchanged a formal nod. Jon noticed the watching Stark soldiers shifting uneasily, uncertain how to regard Stannis. Ghost stood behind Jon, hackles slightly raised as if sensing the tension. Melisandre gazed down at the direwolf, the corners of her mouth lifting in that cryptic, almost smile. Robb gestured toward the siege lines. "We have a command tent prepared. We can discuss our plan of attack there, out of the wind. Most of my lords remain in camp." Stannis waved a hand. "Lead on." And so they rode back through the swirling drifts, the stag banner now joining the ranks of the direwolf banners. Whispers and mutters spread through the encampment as men recognized Stannis Baratheon. Some spat in the snow, others stared in curiosity, but none made an immediate move to challenge. They knew better than to cross Robb's intent. Still, the friction in the air was palpable. Within the large command tent, men lit extra lanterns to ward off the gloom. Great Jon Umber, the Glovers, the Serwins, and other northern lords gathered, gazes ranging warily over Stannis's retinue. Davos Seaworth was among them. Jon recognized the Onion Knight from their time at the Wall. Davos gave Jon a small, polite nod. Melisandre stood near Stannis, her red robes a stark contrast to the drab furs of the northerners. Robb motioned to the table. "As you can see, we have ringed Winterfell. The Boltons are inside, well provisioned. Our attempts at negotiation have been dismissed with contempt. They claim Ramsay Bolton is Warden of the North by authority of the Lannisters." Stannis's lip curled. "Tommen Baratheon has no such authority. And in any case, he is no rightful king, only a product of incest, if the rumors are to be believed. The Boltons are traitors. We bring them justice." Great Jon Umber let out a growl of approval. "That's the spirit. We've been too long in the cold." Stannis leaned over the map. "We have limited time. Every day we freeze out here, the men become weaker. Your supplies dwindle. If I deploy my siege engines, we'll try to breach the outer wall in at least 2 places. My men know how to bring down castle walls, even strong ones. But we'll need cover from your archers to keep the defenders at bay." Robb traced a line along the north side of the castle. "These sections here are likely weakened from Theon Greyjoy's occupation, though not as much as one might hope. If we focus our towers there, we might have better luck." Jon spoke up, remembering the layout from his youth. "There's also a sally port near the eastern corner of the outer wall. If we keep them busy on the north side, some of our best men might slip in from the east. We'd need to be quick or the Boltons will seal off the inner ward. Stannis nodded grudgingly. We can coordinate. I'll lead the assault on the wall with my men if that is your preference. Robb Stark, you and yours can handle the Sally Port infiltration. Or vice versa. But I find it better if the defenders assume the greater threat is me. They hate you more personally, I suspect, but a southern king might unsettle them. Robb folded his arms. Very well. We can draw up a plan. But let me be clear, once Winterfell is taken, the Boltons must stand trial before a northern court under our laws. I will not hand them over to be burnt by your red priestess. Melisandre's eyes flashed, but Stannis did not argue. They will answer for their treasons. How that justice is served is of less concern to me so long as it is served. A sense of uneasy alliance settled over the council. They hammered out details for another hour, mapping out a probable day of assault, 2 or 3 days hence, to give Stannis' main force time to arrive with the siege machines. Men would approach the walls at dawn, using the partial cover of darkness to conceal their final preparations. Archers would harass the defenders while a smaller group under Jon or Robb tried to exploit weaknesses in the castle's eastern side. When at last the meeting ended, the northerners filtered out, their faces tense but flickering with a spark of hope. Perhaps with Stannis' men they could do this quickly and minimize further suffering. Or so they told themselves. Outside, the wind battered the tents and the swirl of snow continued unabated. Ghost prowled near the edges, sniffing the air for any threat. Jon stepped into the cold and turned at a voice behind him. Melisandre, who'd drawn up, stood in the tent's light. Jon Stark, she said softly so that none but Ghost could overhear. You have chosen the path of war, but do not forget the greater war yet to come. The night is dark and full of terrors far greater than the Boltons. Do not lose sight of that. He stiffened. I have not forgotten the others. She regarded him with that same mysterious calm. Good. For every day we linger in this mortal struggle, the power of the great other grows. I have seen it in the flames. Beware the cost of victory here if it comes too late for all beyond the wall. Jon's hand clenched around the hilt of Longclaw. I know what's at stake, but we cannot let the Boltons hold Winterfell. If the North is not united, we stand no chance against the White Walkers. She nodded, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. There is another fate for you in the flames, Jon Stark. I sense it. Perhaps your name is but one piece of the puzzle. Do you dream of direwolves, of ghosts in the snow? He swallowed. Sometimes. Dreams are dreams. Or portents. Her gaze flicked to Ghost, who stood bristling. Your wolf is part of you. Do not close your heart to what you may become. Before Jon could reply, she slipped away, the wind carrying her back towards Stannis' corner of the camp. Ghost let out a soft growl, then settled. Jon stared after her, mind churning with unease. She had always spoken in riddles and prophecy. Part of him feared she saw truths he could barely comprehend. Another part wanted to dismiss her as a zealot, her visions too obscure to guide anything concrete. Yet the memory of the others loomed at the back of his mind like a silent sentinel. He turned his attention back to the tasks at hand. Men worked through the night, shifting supplies, clearing paths for the eventual arrival of Stannis' larger force. Some of the southern knights had already begun trickling in, dark shapes on the horizon, leading horses burdened with timbers for siege towers. The cold, if anything, seemed to intensify. Fires burned, but the wind snuffed them whenever the gusts grew too strong. Men layered themselves in any rags they could find, pressing close for warmth. Jon found Robb conferring with Great Jon Umber and a few other lords near the main palisade. It's begun then, Robb said, glancing at the knights trudging in from the south. Stannis' men. We'll see if they fare any better in our winter than we do. The poor devils. Jon folded his arms. It might be enough. If we coordinate well, we could crack those walls. I only hope we don't pay too high a price. So do I, Robb murmured, rubbing a hand over the stubble on his jaw. But I'll pay it if I must. This is our home. Our father's seat. Too much blood has already been spilled for me to leave it in Ramsay's hands. Jon couldn't argue with that. He clasped Robb's shoulder, and for a moment they stood as brothers in silent understanding. Ghost pressed against Jon's leg as though offering quiet solidarity. The next 2 days blurred into frantic preparation. Stannis' main body arrived in ragged shape, men stiff from cold, horses thin from hard marches, but they still brought siege machines, heavy trebuchets, rams, and tall ladders. With these, an assault was possible if not guaranteed to succeed. The question was how well-stocked the Boltons truly were and how fiercely they would fight. Rumors circulated that Ramsay himself might be in the castle, skinning men for sport. Others said he had retreated to the Dreadfort. But if the latter were true, who commanded these defenders so fanatically? The day before the planned assault, Jon walked the lines at dusk, checking on the men. Some huddled in small groups, passing a jug of watered wine. Others sat sharpening blades by the glow of torches, eyes distant with worry. The southern knights mingled awkwardly with the Northmen, each group uncertain of the other. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste. The wind carried a metallic tang, like the promise of blood. Jon crouched by a fire where a few younger men were gnawing on hard bread. They looked up at him, saluting uncertainly. "My Lord Stark," one of them mumbled, half in awe, half in fear. "How are your spirits?" Jon asked gently. "We've enough to fill our bellies, at least," another said. "But it's the waiting." The quiet nights, hearing Bolton men laugh beyond the walls. "Makes my skin crawl." Jon nodded. "Tomorrow, or soon after, we take the castle. Stay close to your brothers in arms. Follow your sergeant's orders. We'll see you through this." They offered tentative smiles. Jon clapped one on the shoulder, then moved on, stopping next to a group of archers stringing bows. Each word of encouragement felt like a stone in his throat. He remembered the men of the Night's Watch, how he'd tried to embolden them at the wall, how so many had died anyway. War was savage and unpredictable. All he could do was lead to the best of his ability. By the time he returned to his own tent, the moon was a pale disk behind thick clouds, and the temperature had plunged again. He ducked inside to find Ghost curled on the blankets, ears perked. The direwolf looked at him with calm expectation. Jon sank down, sighing. Tomorrow would be a day of blood. He was sure of it. One way or another, the quiet siege would end in violence. Perhaps the Boltons would capitulate, though that seemed unlikely. Ramsay's cruelty was legend, and the men who followed him were hardened or terrified into loyalty. No, they would have to force their way in. Jon's thoughts circled Melisandre's warning about the time lost in mortal wars while the others gathered strength. But if they let the Boltons remain, the North would remain divided. The realm needed them united to face the nightmares. He drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of a huge dire wolf with red eyes stalking the halls of Winterfell, passing through walls like a phantom. He saw the old crypts again. This time, the statues of the long-dead Stark kings turned their heads as the dire wolf passed. One opened its mouth, and Jon half heard a whisper on the edge of understanding, his name, or something close to it. Then came a flash of light, and he jolted awake, heart hammering, sweat chilling his skin. Ghost nudged him with a concerned whine. Dawn arrived bleak and bitter. The drums sounded across the camp, rousing men from fitful slumber. Jon donned his armor, black leather over ringmail, the Stark sigil newly stitched onto his left breast. He strapped Longclaw to his hip and stepped out into a swirl of snow. Horses stood stamping, breath steaming. Men formed into ranks, grumbling but resolved. He could smell pitch heating in iron cauldrons for the siege engines. Robb rode up, helm under one arm, cloak snapping in the wind. "Ready yourself," he said, eyes intent. "Stannis means to begin the bombardment soon. We're to lead the eastern infiltration with a few hundred men once the defenders are distracted." Jon nodded. "I'll gather them." "Stay safe, brother," Robb said softly. "Watch for the signal." Jon clasped Robb's forearm. "You as well." Then they parted. The next hours rushed by in a haze of barked orders and frantic movement. Stannis's men hauled their trebuchets into position on the north side, setting them up behind makeshift fortifications. Others rigged ladders and siege towers. The plan was to unleash a barrage of stones and flaming pitch at a particular span of wall that was rumored to be weaker. At the same time, a wave of men under Stannis's direct command would surge forward. Meanwhile, Robb and Jon would circle eastward with their contingent, prepared to break in through the lesser gate if the defenders drew away. Jon found himself at the head of some 300 men, archers, swordsmen, and a handful of Umber berserkers who insisted on joining. Ghost prowled at his side, drawing uneasy looks from the southerners who had never seen a dire wolf so large. A hush fell as they marched through swirling drifts, staying low behind a stand of half-burned oak trees near the eastern wall. The fortress loomed ahead, dark and seemingly silent. Then, with a sudden thunderous whoosh, the first stones launched from the trebuchets, arcing through the air and crashing into the castle ramparts. A rumble shook the earth. Seconds later came another volley, then another. Jon watched from his vantage as chunks of wall crumbled beneath the onslaught, sending Bolton men scrambling. Arrows whistled out of the castle, lighting up the gloom. Stannis's men returned fire, and soon the entire north side of Winterfell erupted into a cacophony of violence and smoke. Robb, crouched beside Jon, cupped a gloved hand around his mouth. "Wait for the second wave. Then we move." Jon nodded, adrenaline surging. The smell of burning pitch drifted on the wind, carrying the acrid tang of war. He glimpsed men on the battlements dropping as Stannis's archers found their marks. The shrieks of the wounded cut through the roar of impact. The defenders poured boiling oil over the walls, setting men aflame. Jon's stomach tightened at the horror of it, but he forced himself to remain focused. At last, Robb gave the signal. Their group rushed forward toward the eastern side, hugging the shadows of the walls. There, a smaller gatehouse and postern offered a possible entrance. Jon reached the heavy oak doors and found them barred from within, as expected. "Ram!" he shouted. A crew of men hefted a stout battering ram, the beam wrapped in iron, and began to smash it against the gate. Inside, the defenders must have realized the ploy, for arrows and crossbow bolts clattered against the stone around them. One took down a man beside Jon. Ghost growled, leaping forward to snap at a Bolton soldier who aimed a crossbow out of an arrow slit. The soldier yelped, recoiling. The ram slammed again, which splintered. A third time, and the top hinge cracked. Men roared encouragement, pushing harder. Arrows whizzed overhead. Robb kept a shield raised, glancing at Jon with fierce determination. On the next strike, the gate burst inward, and the Stark men poured through the shattered door, swords raised, howling defiance. Jon led the charge, Longclaw gleaming in the scattered light. The courtyard beyond was smaller than the main yard, strewn with rubble and half-collapsed outbuildings. Bolton men waited with shields locked. The clash was immediate and brutal. Jon hacked at the first soldier, slicing open his thigh. Robb drove his sword through another. Behind them, the mass of men crowded in, the press of bodies intense. Screams and metal rang out. Ghost darted between combatants, a flash of white fangs. At the far end of the courtyard, more Bolton soldiers formed a line, trying to hold them at bay. Jon bellowed a command for archers to target them. Several arrows took the defenders in the chest and face. Jon seized the moment, pushing forward. Beyond, a doorway led deeper into Winterfell's interior. Jon recognized the route that wound near the kitchens, though the place was blackened and half-collapsed from the earlier sacking. The smell of old ash mingled with the stink of fresh blood. Step by step, they advanced, cutting down any Bolton man who resisted. Some threw down arms, crying for mercy. Others fought with desperate frenzy, cornered animals in their last stand. Robb signaled for a portion of the men to secure the courtyard while the rest pressed on. Jon, flanked by a pair of Umber soldiers, led a push into a side corridor. Flames licked at the battered stone from a brazier knocked over in the melee. The flickering light cast dancing shadows, revealing doors and archways battered or boarded shut. A Bolton soldier lunged from behind a crumbled arch, swinging a flail. One Umber soldier took the blow to his shield, stumbling, then countered with a savage axe strike. Jon ducked under another swing, Longclaw cleaving the man's wrist. He heard a gurgling scream, saw the flail drop with a clang. They pressed onward, the sense of old memories warring with the horror of present destruction. Jon remembered passing these halls as a boy, but everything was changed. Walls were scorched black, tapestries torn down. The floor was strewn with debris, splintered beams, old bones. A sobering reminder that war had been here long before them. As they rounded a corner, they met more resistance. A cluster of heavily armed Bolton knights barred the way, led by a tall figure wearing a helm fashioned like a snarling hound. The knights charged. The corridor erupted in a flurry of steel. The leading Umber soldier went down with a lance through his gut. Another was battered aside by a warhammer blow that broke his ribs with a sickening crunch. Jon and Robb both darted in, side by side. The hound-helmed knight swung a mace at Robb, who blocked with his shield but staggered at the force. Jon seized the knight's momentary exposure, driving Longclaw at an angle beneath the knight's raised arm. The Valyrian steel bit deep through mail, lodging with a wet snap. The knight groaned, staggering. Jon wrenched Longclaw free, blood spraying. Robb finished him with a thrust to the throat. The other Bolton knights, seeing their leader fall, fought on with grim resolve, but one by one the combined might of Starks and Umbers overwhelmed them. The corridor ran red with gore. Panting, Jon wiped sweat from his brow, ignoring the sting of a shallow cut on his forearm. Robb signaled for them to keep moving. Somewhere deeper in Winterfell, the thunder of siege stones could still be heard, along with the roar of men battling. Smoke drifted through the corridors. Jon realized that parts of the castle must be on fire, likely from the flaming pitch or from sabotage. They hurried forward, mindful that they could be trapped in a burning ruin if the conflagration spread. At length, they emerged into the great hall. Jon's heart lurched at the sight. The roof had partially caved in near the dais, letting gray light and swirling snow fall through the exposed rafters. The once proud banners of House Stark had been torn down, replaced with ragged remnants of Bolton devices. The hearth in the center was cold. Rubble and charred beams littered the floor. A handful of Bolton men stood here, among them a figure in a battered fur cloak that carried a certain swagger. This man had a scar across his jaw and wore a partial mail coif. He turned at the intrusion, eyes widening. "Starks," he spat, leveling a longsword. "You think you'll take this hall from me so easily?" "Stand down," Robb commanded, sword raised. "You've lost." The man barked a laugh. "Lost? You've only just begun dying." He lunged at Robb, swift as a viper. Robb narrowly parried, bracing against the floor. Another Bolton man attacked from Jon's left, forcing him to pivot. The hall dissolved into a chaotic melee again. Ghost sprang on a soldier, tearing him down by the shoulder. Jon crossed blades with another, their swords ringing. The man was skilled, forcing Jon to give ground. A quick feint from Jon baited the soldier into an overhand cut. Jon sidestepped, slashed the man's exposed flank, and finished him with a thrust to the chest. He turned to see the scar-jawed leader pressing Robb back. They moved in a deadly dance across the rubble. At the corner of Jon's vision, more Stark men arrived, reinforcing the fight. One soldier rushed the scar-jawed man from behind, but the Bolton leader whirled and slashed him across the face. Robb seized the moment, driving his sword into the man's torso. The Bolton staggered, spitting blood. Robb twisted his blade free. "Where's Ramsay?" he demanded, voice echoing in the ruined hall. "Tell me." The Bolton man only laughed, staggering. "Ramsay, he's not here. Riding the fields, perhaps? Or feasting on crows. You'll never catch him." He coughed red, sagged to his knees. "This place belongs to the flayed man now." Robb's face hardened. "No. It belongs to the wolves." He drove the sword down again, ending it. The hall fell silent, save for the crackle of distant flames. Jon lowered Longclaw, chest heaving, letting the reality sink in. The Boltons in this part of the castle were dead or subdued. Shouts echoed from beyond the hall, but from the timbre it sounded like Stannis' men or the Umber's finishing pockets of resistance. Robb turned a slow circle, surveying the ruin. Their father's seat, the heart of House Stark, was a shattered shell. The dais was crumbled, the chairs broken. Snow drifted in from the collapsed roof overhead. Jon felt an ache in his chest, remembering the feasts they once shared here, the laughter and clatter of cutlery, the bards singing. Now it was a graveyard. Men trickled in, reporting that Stannis' forces had breached the main gate. The defenders were fleeing or surrendering. The courtyard was awash with bodies. Fires raged in the northern tower, but men were working to contain it. The castle, battered as it was, had fallen. Amid the swirl of post-battle chaos, Stannis himself appeared in the great doorway, flanked by a column of knights bearing the stag banner. He took in the scene with the same grim expression he always wore. His eyes locked on Robb. "So it is done. The Boltons are scattered and Winterfell is ours." Robb stood in the center of the hall, sword red with blood, hair flecked with ash. "Winterfell is House Stark's, King Stannis," he said evenly. Stannis gave a curt nod, acknowledging the distinction. "Very well. But we hold it together until the last Bolton is taken or until we find their so-called warden, Ramsay. He will not slip away if I have any say." Men around them sagged with relief or slumped in exhaustion. Some began hauling the dead Bolton soldiers into piles. Others set about searching for survivors among the rubble. Jon felt a wave of bone-deep weariness. They had reclaimed Winterfell, but the cost was etched on every battered face. And from the look of the black smoke curling up from multiple corners, the damage to the castle might be even worse than he'd feared. He found Robb near the dais, staring at the Stark banners that had been torn down. Only scraps of old cloth remained. Robb exhaled, turning his gaze to Jon. "We've won back Father's house," Robb said, voice thick with emotion. "But it feels hollow. So much ruin, so many dead." Jon laid a hand on Robb's shoulder. "We can rebuild. We have to for the north." Robb looked up at the ruined rafters, through which dull daylight filtered, swirling with ash and snow. "Yes," he said softly, as though trying to convince himself. "We'll rebuild. The north stands." Jon nodded. All around them, men hurried to secure the fortress, to douse the fires, to gather the wounded. Stannis barked orders to his knights, not pausing to rest. The savage chords of battle still rang in Jon's ears, but a small spark of hope kindled in his heart. House Stark had reclaimed Winterfell. Despite the cracks in the walls and the blackened scars, the seat of the North was back in Stark hands. Yet the specter of Ramsay Bolton lingered. If he was not here, he remained at large, a dangerous foe in a realm battered by war. And beyond him lurked the far greater threat, the one that Melisandre warned of, the others, the creeping tide of the undead. Even as men bustled around him, Jon could not shake the sense that all of this was but a prelude. Winterfell was theirs, but the true winter lay ahead. He closed his eyes, taking in the smell of smoke and blood, feeling Ghost's warmth pressed against his leg. He silently prayed to the old gods that this victory might not be too late, that the North could rise anew and face what was coming. In that moment, beneath the broken roof of the hall where he had once stood as a boy, he felt a swirl of pride, sorrow, and resolve. He was Jon Stark, standing with his brother in the seat of their forefathers, determined to guide the North through the storms yet to come. And come they would, as certain as the snow that sifted down through the gaping hole above them, landing on the ancient stone floor of a castle that had seen ages of kings and would, if the gods were kind, see more.